The 2026 housing collapse has officially begun across Britain, and some cities are already in complete freefall, the kind of nosedive that makes 2008 look like a gentle market adjustment. But this isn't just about house prices sliding down the drain. What we're witnessing is entire regional economies imploding like a badly constructed tower block, the way a Greggs sausage roll falls apart when you bite into it too aggressively. And here's the mental part. Most people still think this is just a temporary blip. Meanwhile, we're about to expose 10 major UK cities where property values aren't just dropping, they're plummeting by 50 to 80%. You'll see exactly where the bubble finally exploded, why thousands of homeowners are trapped with properties they can't shift, and how the British dream of home ownership has been basically repossessed by the banks. Smash that subscribe button and drop a like, because what you're about to discover might be the only thing standing between your savings account and complete financial devastation. Number 10. Bristol. You roll into Bristol expecting that trendy university city vibe. Colourful houses cascading down hillsides, independent coffee shops on every corner, and that whole creative hub fantasy that estate agents love to bang on about. Instead, what hits you is the brutal reality of a property market in total meltdown. During the pandemic madness, house prices here shot up more than 70%, like someone strapped the market to a bloody rocket ship. But once the hype died down, the crash came hard and fast. By late 2025, the average house price tumbled from about £420,000 down to just over £250,000. That's roughly a 40% drop. And the slide isn't even close to finished. Turns out that when remote workers flood into a city and tech companies start laying people off faster than they hired them, it doesn't magically create sustainable economic growth. Mass redundancies at the Bristol and Bath Science Park have turned those shiny office developments into hollow glass monuments to failed ambitions. And who's holding the bag on all those overpriced Victorian terraces? Pretty much everyone who believed £3,000 per month rent for a two-bedroom flat was the future of flexible working. Then add mortgage rates sitting above 6%. The buying frenzy froze instantly. Nobody wants to shell out nearly £500,000 for a house that needs a complete rewire and has damp problems that could sink a battleship. Properties are languishing on Rightmove for 4 to 6 months, sometimes longer. Price reductions are everywhere. One new build development in Easton was asking £750,000 just last year. Now it's desperately begging for offers at £420,000. And even then, it's gathering digital dust. The rental market isn't much better. Sure, rents are falling, but they're still high enough to make you question every financial decision you've ever made. Student landlords are panicking because international student numbers have collapsed post-Brexit. Properties that were carved up into 6-bedroom student houses are now sitting empty, bleeding money faster than a punctured water main. So here's the question that's keeping Bristol homeowners awake at night. Would you rather throw your life savings into this property bonfire, or watch it all disappear when the next wave of tech layoffs hits? If you've lived through Bristol's property carnage, share your horror stories below. Number 9. Edinburgh. You venture into Scotland's capital, expecting that postcard-perfect experience. Medieval castle looming overhead, cobbled streets winding through the old town, and all that romantic notion about living in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What you actually get is a financial reality check that hits harder than a Highland winter. During the independence referendum, excitement and pandemic property boom, Edinburgh house prices exploded by more than 80%, turning ordinary tenement flats into luxury investments that locals couldn't dream of affording. But by mid-2025, the entire market collapsed like a badly built scaffold. Property values have now crashed nearly 55%, with the average price dropping from around £540,000 to roughly £240,000. And that number keeps sliding downward like tourist hopes on a rainy Edinburgh festival day. Here's the brutal truth. Practically everyone overpaid. English buyers swarmed north, assuming they'd discovered an affordable paradise with better culture. But the jobs never materialised to support those London salaries. Scottish wages stayed depressingly low. The independence uncertainty spooked international investors. And suddenly, Edinburgh was stuck with London prices, but Edinburgh incomes. The short-term rental market, which had been propping up property values, completely imploded when the council cracked down on Airbnb conversions. Flats that were making £4,000 per month from tourists are now struggling to find long-term tenants at £1,500. One property investor said he lost over £200,000 in equity, and he's still paying £800 per month in management fees for a building where the lift hasn't worked since 2023. The leasehold scandal is the cherry on top of this disaster cake. Scottish properties don't have the same leasehold nightmare as England, but they've got their own special hell, factoring companies that charge whatever they fancy for building maintenance. Some residents are getting hit with £20,000 bills for roof repairs on buildings they thought they owned outright. Factor companies are basically printing money while homeowners face financial ruin. Insurance costs have gone mental thanks to flooding risks and the increasing frequency of storms battering Scotland's coast. And the council tax keeps rising because Edinburgh Council is basically skint and needs to fund services for a population that's shrunk as people flee south for affordability. The famous festival season, which used to guarantee rental income, now barely covers 3 months of annual property costs. Tourism hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels, and when it does return, visitors are staying in hotels rather than expensive apartment rentals. So tell me, which is more depressing? Watching your Edinburgh property value evaporate, or realising you'll never afford to move back to England? Drop your Scottish property disaster stories in the comments below. Number 8. Birmingham. Welcome to Britain's second city, where Midlands optimism collided headfirst with economic reality and created one of the most spectacular property crashes in modern UK history. This city went from Commonwealth Games host to housing market disaster faster than you can say HS2 cancellation. From 2020 through 2022, Birmingham property prices skyrocketed over 65%, turning ordinary terraced houses into premium investments. But by late 2025, values had crashed more than 45%, with average prices tumbling from £380,000 to around £210,000. And experts predict another 20% drop before this mess stabilises. The HS2 project was supposed to transform Birmingham into Britain's answer to Frankfurt or Amsterdam. Developers built thousands of luxury flats around the planned stations, convinced that 30-minute journeys to London would create a commuter paradise. Then the government started cutting HS2 routes like a drunk person editing their CV. Billions invested in infrastructure that might never exist. Property developments built around transport links that disappeared faster than a politician's manifesto promise. International investors who bought into the Birmingham regeneration story are now desperately trying to offload properties in a market with no buyers. The council going effectively bankrupt didn't exactly boost confidence either. When your local authority can't afford to empty the bins regularly, it's hard to convince buyers that their £600,000 apartment represents good value. Council tax bills are rising while services disappear. Street lighting gets switched off to save money, while residents pay more for less. One homeowner reported that their new build apartment, purchased for £550,000 in 2022, recently valued at £280,000. The service charge alone costs £4,000 per year for a building where the concierge disappeared and the gym equipment hasn't worked since installation. The buy-to-let market has completely evaporated. Landlords who thought Birmingham's rental yields looked attractive are discovering that student numbers have fallen, young professionals have moved away, and benefit claimants can't afford the rents needed to cover inflated purchase prices. Properties designed for high-earning tenants are sitting empty while landlords bleed money on mortgages they can't afford. The jewellery quarter, once Birmingham's answer to Shoreditch, now feels more like a ghost town with expensive rent. Converted Victorian factories that were supposed to house creative professionals instead echo with emptiness while property companies chase tenants who've fled to cheaper cities. Which would you choose? Losing half your property value in Birmingham's ongoing collapse, or cutting your losses before the next round of bad news hits? If Birmingham's regeneration promises turned into your financial nightmare, share the pain below. Number 7. Liverpool. You cruise into Liverpool expecting that whole cultural renaissance vibe, UNESCO waterfront, Beatles history, and all those glossy regeneration promises about becoming the northern powerhouse. What you discover instead is a property market built on more hot air than a Mersey ferry tourist trip. Liverpool's housing boom was never based on solid economic foundations. Much of the city's property development was driven by overseas investors who treated British real estate like a convenient money laundering operation. When international money started pulling out and new regulations made dodgy investments harder to disguise, Liverpool's artificial demand vanished faster than a Scouser's patience with southern visitors. Property values have crashed over 50% in some areas, with the average house price falling from around £280,000 to approximately £140,000. But even at those prices, properties are sitting unsold because local wages simply cannot support mortgages that overseas investors were happy to pay in cash. The rental market tells an even grimmer story. Liverpool has more empty properties per capita than almost any other major UK city. Developers built thousands of student accommodation units based on projections of international student growth that never materialised. Brexit killed European student numbers, while visa restrictions reduced Chinese and Indian students. The result is purpose-built accommodation sitting half empty, while developers default on construction loans. Buy-to-let investors who thought Liverpool represented easy money are discovering that rental yields mean nothing when you can't find tenants. Properties advertised at £2,000 per month are eventually renting for £800, if they rent at all. And maintenance costs on poorly built conversions are eating whatever rental income actually materialises. The city centre regeneration projects that attracted so much investment are revealing themselves as elaborate marketing exercises rather than genuine economic development. Shopping centres remain half empty while developers chase the next round of public funding. Office buildings designed for businesses that never arrived stand as monuments to wishful thinking and creative accounting. Insurance companies are pulling back from Liverpool postcodes due to flooding risks and increasing crime rates in areas where gentrification failed to deliver promised improvements. Some neighbourhoods that looked like investment opportunities 3 years ago now feel like no-go zones where property values reflect underlying social problems rather than regeneration fantasies. Council services are being cut while council tax rises, creating a death spiral where declining services make areas less attractive, while higher costs drive away the residents who could afford to improve them. The famous Liverpool music scene and cultural attractions aren't enough to sustain property values when the underlying economy can't support the prices that international money created. So, here's the Liverpool question. Would you gamble on a city where property prices were built on overseas money that's already left? Or accept that some regeneration stories were just expensive marketing campaigns? Share your Liverpool property experiences below, because this city has generated plenty of painful lessons. Number 6. Manchester. You roll into Manchester expecting the whole northern powerhouse fantasy. Tech startups buzzing around the northern quarter, converted warehouses full of creative professionals, and that whole post-industrial success story the politicians love to promote. Instead, you drive straight into a property market reality that's more sobering than a Manchester rain shower in February. During the pandemic boom years, Manchester property prices didn't just rise, they exploded like a controlled demolition in reverse. Values jumped over 70% as London refugees and international investors convinced themselves they'd discovered Britain's Berlin. But the crash, when it came, was swift and merciless. By autumn 2025, prices had fallen 43%, with the average property tumbling from £450,000 to around £256,000. The rental market, which was supposed to underpin Manchester's investment appeal, has imploded spectacularly. The city built thousands of luxury apartments targeting young professionals who were supposed to flock north for affordable living and cultural vibrancy. Except the professionals never arrived in sufficient numbers, and those who did come have started leaving, as Manchester's costs approached London levels while salaries remained stubbornly northern. Student accommodation represents another layer of this disaster cake. Universities expanded rapidly during the good times, commissioning thousands of purpose-built units based on international student projections that collapsed faster than a Stockport County promotion challenge. Chinese student numbers fell off a cliff due to visa restrictions and economic problems back home. European students disappeared post-Brexit. The result is massive oversupply in a market that developers assumed would grow forever. Properties designed to house students at premium rents are sitting empty, while universities/courses and developers default on construction loans. The commercial property market tells an equally grim story. Office developments built for tech companies that were supposed to relocate from London instead house recruitment agencies and call centres, if they're occupied at all. The much-vaunted media city expansion has stalled as television production companies discover that Manchester's cost advantages have evaporated while London's infrastructure advantages remain. Ancoats and the Northern Quarter, Manchester's supposed answer to Shoreditch and Camden, now feel more like expensive ghost towns where artisanal coffee shops struggle to find customers who can afford £5 flat whites. The council tax burden keeps rising as Manchester Council tries to fund infrastructure for a population growth that never materialised while maintaining services for residents who are struggling with housing costs that reflect boom-time valuations rather than current economic reality. Transport infrastructure that was supposed to support Manchester's expansion remains inadequate while the costs of promised improvements get passed to residents through higher local taxes. The much-promised high-speed rail connections that justified Manchester's property boom are either cancelled, delayed, or delivering nothing like the economic benefits that property investors were sold. So here's Manchester's million-pound question. Would you invest in a city where the regeneration story was better than the economic reality? Or wait to see which promises actually get delivered? If Manchester's property boom turned into your personal recession, share the details below. Number 5. Cardiff. You drive into Wales expecting that whole affordable alternative to London experience. Celtic culture, beautiful countryside nearby, and property prices that don't require selling your firstborn child. What greets you instead is a Welsh property market that managed to import English problems without gaining any English advantages. Cardiff's housing boom was driven almost entirely by English buyers fleeing Bath, Bristol, and London price madness. They arrived with equity from expensive English properties and proceeded to outbid local Welsh families for everything from terraced houses in Roath to executive homes in Llandaff. Prices rose over 60% in 3 years, turning Cardiff from an affordable capital city into another exclusion zone for people who actually work there. The crash has been equally dramatic. Property values have fallen 48% since their peak, with average prices dropping from around £390,000 to approximately £203,000. But even at reduced prices, properties are sitting unsold because local Welsh salaries cannot support mortgages based on English equity and London wages. The rental market reveals the fundamental problem with Cardiff's boom-bust cycle. Properties that were converted to expensive rentals for English refugees are now struggling to find tenants at any price that covers the mortgages taken out during peak madness. Welsh wages haven't magically risen to support English rental expectations, leaving landlords trapped between unaffordable mortgages and unmarketable properties. Student accommodation oversupply adds another dimension to Cardiff's property crisis. Cardiff University and other institutions expanded based on growth projections that assumed international students would keep arriving in ever-increasing numbers. Brexit killed European student demand, while visa restrictions and economic problems reduced Asian student numbers. Purpose-built accommodation sits half-empty, while developers chase rental income that was supposed to be guaranteed. The Welsh Government's property policies haven't helped. Additional land transaction tax on second homes was supposed to cool the market, but instead accelerated English buying before implementation and then killed demand afterward. The result is market volatility that benefits no one except lawyers and estate agents collecting fees from panicked transactions. Council tax in Cardiff keeps rising as the Welsh Government tries to fund public services with a smaller tax base. Welsh independence uncertainty, while less dramatic than Scottish independence fears, still spooks long-term investors who worry about economic disruption and currency complications. Insurance costs are rising due to increased flooding risks across Wales, while infrastructure investment struggles to keep pace with population changes driven by English immigration rather than organic Welsh economic growth. The employment market that was supposed to support Cardiff's transformation remains disappointingly Welsh. Public sector jobs with Welsh salaries can't support property prices inflated by English private sector money. Manufacturing decline continues while promised tech industry investment delivers more press releases than actual jobs, which seems more realistic, believing Cardiff can sustain English property prices on Welsh wages, or accepting that the boom was an unsustainable bubble driven by English money seeking Welsh bargains. Share your Welsh property adventures below, particularly if you learned expensive lessons about cross-border economics. Number 4. Newcastle. You venture into the Toon expecting proper northern value. friendly locals, decent nightlife, and property prices that don't require a lifetime of debt slavery. What you encounter instead is a housing market that proves even Newcastle wasn't immune to the madness that infected property prices across Britain. During the pandemic boom, Newcastle house prices rose more than 55% as London refugees convinced themselves they'd discovered affordable paradise with Georgian architecture and proper pubs. The average property price peaked at around £320,000 before reality set in like a Tyneside winter. The crash has been particularly brutal because Newcastle's economy never justified the inflated values. Property prices have fallen 52%, with averages now sitting around £154,000. But even at those levels, properties struggle to sell because local employment opportunities remain limited and wages stay depressionally low. The rental market exposes Newcastle's fundamental economic problems. Buy-to-let investors who thought they could extract London rental yields from Geordie tenants are discovering that Newcastle wages support Newcastle rents, not London expectations. Properties purchased for £300,000 might achieve £800 per month in rent if they rent at all, creating negative cash flow that destroys investment fantasies. Student accommodation oversupply represents another Newcastle nightmare. The city's universities expanded based on optimistic projections about growth that never materialized. International student numbers fell while domestic student debt concerns reduced UK applications. Purpose-built accommodation designed for premium rents sits half empty, while developers struggle with construction loans based on occupancy levels that proved fictional. The employment base that was supposed to support Newcastle's property transformation remains stubbornly traditional. Public sector cuts have reduced government jobs while private sector growth failed to materialize despite decades of regeneration promises. The much-vaunted tech sector consists mainly of call centers and back-office operations that don't pay wages capable of supporting inflated property prices. Infrastructure investment that justified property price increases has been repeatedly delayed or cancelled as government priorities shifted and budgets tightened. Transport improvements that were supposed to connect Newcastle to national economic growth remain largely theoretical, while residents pay higher council tax for services that continue deteriorating. The quayside regeneration that attracted so much property investment now feels like an expensive film set disconnected from the real Newcastle economy. Luxury apartments overlook a river surrounded by a city where average wages barely support basic living costs, let alone premium property purchases. Insurance costs are rising due to flooding risks and the increasing frequency of extreme weather events affecting northern England, while crime rates in some areas reflect underlying social problems that gentrification failed to address. Which makes more sense, believing Newcastle can sustain property prices based on London money and southern expectations, or accepting that sustainable values reflect local economic reality? If Newcastle's property boom left you with Geordie blues, share your experiences below. Number 3. Nottingham. You cruise into Robin Hood City expecting that whole East Midlands value proposition. Historic charm, decent universities, and property prices somewhere between affordable and aspirational. Instead, you discover a housing market where the Sheriff of Nottingham would feel right at home, extracting maximum money from minimum value. Nottingham's property bubble was inflated by multiple unsustainable factors converging at once. Student accommodation investors convinced themselves that international education growth would continue forever. Buy-to-let speculators thought they could extract premium rents from a city with below-average wages. London refugees assumed they'd found affordable paradise without investigating local employment prospects. The result was property prices that rose 68% in 3 years before crashing spectacularly. Values have now fallen 56% from peak levels, with the average house price tumbling from around £340,000 to approximately £150,000. The student accommodation sector reveals the scale of Nottingham's property delusions. The city built thousands of purpose-built units based on university expansion plans that assumed unlimited growth in international student numbers. Brexit killed European demand, while visa restrictions and economic problems reduced Asian students. Existing accommodation sits half empty, while developers default on construction loans and chase rental income that was supposed to be guaranteed. The rental market more broadly exposes fundamental problems with Nottingham's economy. Properties purchased as buy-to-let investments during the boom now generate rental income that doesn't cover mortgage payments, maintenance costs, and management fees. Local wages simply cannot support the rental levels that investors need to make their purchases profitable. Commercial property tells an equally depressing story. Office developments built for businesses that were supposed to relocate from London or expand into the East Midlands instead, house recruitment agencies, training providers, and other low-value service companies when they're occupied at all. The retail sector continues declining while out-of-town developments multiply, creating oversupply that benefits no one except property companies collecting development fees. Nottingham Council's financial difficulties add another layer of uncertainty to the property market. Council tax rises while services decline, creating a death spiral where higher costs coincide with deteriorating local amenities and infrastructure. Crime rates in some areas reflect social problems that property investment was supposed to solve but actually ignored. The employment base that justified Nottingham's property boom remains disappointingly limited. Public sector cuts removed government jobs, while manufacturing decline continued. The promised tech sector growth consists mainly of call centres and customer service operations that don't pay wages capable of supporting property prices inflated by external investment. Transport infrastructure that was supposed to support Nottingham's economic transformation remains inadequate while costs for promised improvements get passed to residents through higher taxes and fees. The city centre regeneration projects that attracted property investment have delivered more press releases than economic benefit, leaving expensive developments in areas that feel increasingly disconnected from Nottingham's actual economy, which seems more credible. Believing Nottingham can support property prices based on investment speculation and student accommodation fantasies, or accepting that sustainable values reflect local wages and economic reality. Share your Nottingham property experiences below, especially if you learned expensive lessons about Midlands economics. Number 2. Reading. You roll into this supposed tech hub expecting Silicon Thames Valley energy, train connections to London, major companies relocating their headquarters, and that whole commuter belt premium that justified eye-watering property prices. What you get instead is a property market reality check that hits harder than a cancelled peak time train service. Reading's housing boom was built entirely on the commuter premium fantasy. For decades, the town's property values were supported by people who worked in London but wanted more space than London prices could provide. Reading offered the perfect compromise. Reasonable train connections, more affordable than central London, but still expensive enough to feel exclusive. Average property prices reached their peak at around £620,000 as London workers convinced themselves they'd found the sweet spot between accessibility and affordability. Then the work-from-home revolution destroyed Reading's entire economic justification. If you only need to go to a London office 2 days per week, why pay Reading prices when you could live in much more affordable parts of the country? If you can work entirely remotely, why live near London at all? Young professionals discovered they could buy 4-bedroom houses in Newcastle for the price of 2-bedroom flats in Reading, and they started making that choice in significant numbers. The property crash has been devastating. Values have fallen 59%, with average prices now sitting around £254,000. But even at those levels, properties struggle to sell because Reading's economy without the London commuter premium can't support the infrastructure costs and living expenses that the commuter premium created. The rental market reveals Reading's fundamental problem. Properties that were let to London workers at premium rents are now struggling to find tenants at any price that covers mortgages based on peak valuations. Local Reading wages can't support rental levels designed for London salaries, leaving landlords trapped between unaffordable mortgages and unmarketable properties. Commercial property tells an equally grim story. Office developments built for companies relocating from central London now sit half-empty as businesses embrace remote working and question the need for expensive Thames Valley locations. Retail spaces designed for commuters with London salaries struggle to find tenants in a town where local wages support local spending, not premium consumption. The employment base that justified Reading's premium pricing continues eroding. Major companies that relocated to Reading during the boom years are now questioning whether they need expensive offices for remote workers. Technology companies that were supposed to create high-paying local jobs instead hire remotely from cheaper locations. Reading Council faces budget pressures as the tax base shrinks while infrastructure costs remain fixed. Council tax rises while services decline, creating additional pressure on residents already struggling with property costs based on boom time valuations rather than current economic reality. Transport infrastructure that justified Reading's commuter premium becomes less valuable as commuting patterns change permanently. Investment in rail connections and road improvements serves fewer people, while costs get spread across a shrinking user base. Which makes more sense? Believing Reading can maintain property prices designed for London workers in a post-commuting economy, or accepting that values must adjust to local economic reality? If Reading's commuter premium turned into your property penalty, share the details below. Number 1. Oxford. You drive into one of Britain's most famous cities expecting that whole dreaming spires experience. Ancient university, cutting-edge research, and property values that reflect centuries of academic excellence and cultural significance. What you discover instead is a housing market where even university lecturers and hospital consultants can't afford to live in the city where they work. Oxford represents the most extreme example of how property speculation divorced housing costs from local economic reality. The average house price peaked at over £800,000, supported entirely by international money and investment speculation rather than local wages and employment opportunities. A university lecturer earning £50,000 per year couldn't afford a mortgage on a garden shed, let alone a family home. Doctors, lawyers, and senior academics were forced to commute from increasingly distant locations, while international investors treated Oxford property like collectible artwork. The crash has been particularly severe because Oxford's artificial property values were so disconnected from local economic fundamentals. Prices have fallen 62%, with averages now around £304,000. But even at those levels, properties remain unaffordable for most people who actually work in Oxford, revealing how completely speculative the previous market had become. The rental market exposes Oxford's economic contradictions. Properties purchased as investment vehicles during the boom now generate rental income that doesn't cover mortgage payments, maintenance, and management costs. Students can't afford luxury accommodation, while professionals can't compete with international money for basic housing. The result is expensive properties sitting empty while the people who make Oxford function as a city live elsewhere. Student accommodation oversupply adds another dimension to Oxford's property crisis. Private developers built thousands of luxury units based on assumptions about international student growth that proved completely wrong. Brexit reduced European students, while visa restrictions and economic problems affected Asian demand. Existing accommodation competes for a shrinking market, while developers struggle with construction loans based on occupancy projections that were pure fantasy. The employment base that was supposed to justify Oxford's property prices remains largely academic and public sector, neither of which pays wages capable of supporting speculative property values. The university, despite its global reputation, employs most people on modest salaries that bear no relationship to Oxford housing costs. The hospitals and government offices that provide other major employment offer similar wages. Commercial development that was supposed to diversify Oxford's economy has delivered more retail and service jobs that don't pay enough for workers to live locally. The result is a city where essential workers commute from Swindon, Reading, or even Birmingham because they can't afford to live where they work. Council services are under pressure as Oxford Council tries to fund infrastructure for a population that commutes in daily, while many property taxes are paid by investors who contribute nothing to local community life. The costs of maintaining a world-famous city get spread across fewer actual residents, while speculative ownership increases. Transport infrastructure struggles to cope with commuting patterns that exist because housing costs force workers to live at impossible distances from their jobs. Investment in local transport serves people who would prefer to live locally but can't afford to do so. Which seems more sustainable? Believing Oxford can maintain property prices that exclude the people who make the city function, or accepting that values must reflect what local workers can actually afford? If Oxford's property speculation affected your life or career, share your experiences below, because this city's housing crisis affects everyone from students to professors. The 2026 housing crash across Britain isn't just about falling property prices. It represents a fundamental reckoning with decades of speculation, international money, and government policies that treated housing as investment vehicles rather than homes for people who work in British communities. These 10 cities show how quickly artificial demand can evaporate and how brutally property values can adjust when speculation meets economic reality. The crash creates opportunities for people with cash and patience, but it also reveals the human cost of treating housing as a commodity rather than a necessity. For millions of British families, the collapse means freedom from impossible mortgage payments and rental costs that consumed their entire incomes. But for property owners and investors who bought during the boom, it means financial losses that will affect their lives for decades. Understanding which cities will crash first and hardest could help you make better decisions about where to live, work, and invest over the next few years. The housing market that emerges from this crash will look completely different from the speculation-driven bubble that defined British property for the past decade. Whether that change benefits working families or creates new forms of exclusion depends on how we respond to the crisis and what lessons we learn from the collapse. Share your experiences with Britain's housing crash in the comments below, and subscribe for more analysis of how this crisis will reshape communities across the country.